Welcome back to Book Break. In this video, we are going to get controversial, talking about some of the most controversial books. And we all know that books have the power to get people very worked up. At the most extreme end, we've got things like book banning and censorship, which is a massive conversation. Famously, books like American Psycho, Lolita, Satanic Verses have been banned in many countries. The Satanic Verses was so controversial because of its perceived blasphemy that the author, Salman Rushdie, actually had to go into police protection because of attacks on his life. The translator of that book was murdered. So why is it that books have such a terrifying power? Well, we know as book lovers that books have an amazing power to make people think differently, to start conversations that challenge the status quo, and that can really scare people and that can make people really angry, but it's also incredible. It's what's so wonderful about books. So for this video, I've put together a list of 7 books that haven't been banned yet, but definitely have the power to start conversations that are really worth having. In Vladimir by Julia May Jonas, the main character is an English professor and her husband is a professor at the same university, and he is currently at the center of an investigation because of his relationships with some of his students. Now, these two professors have always had a pretty open relationship when it comes to their extramarital affairs, but the allegations against her husband are now changing everything, putting them in a much more uncomfortable position. So these two professors find themselves at the center of a scandal. And just at that moment, a young, handsome, married author arrives on campus, and our main character finds herself developing an unhealthy obsession. So this book will start some controversial conversations about power and desire, about narcissism, about fidelity, and it goes into some pretty charged territory. It's described in the front here as a deliciously dark fable of sex and power. Then The Melting by Lise Spit, and just look at the cover of this one. You can tell this one is meant to be provoking. So this is about a young woman who goes back to her hometown to revisit the site of her trauma. She grew up in a small town with 2 male best friends, and the 3 children started this game that turned out to have violent, serious consequences. So Eva has spent the last 13 years of her life trying to forget her past, but now she's back. She's got a block of ice in the boot of her car and she is ready to settle the score. So this book will spark conversations about both physical and psychological violence, as well as about neglect, abuse, and revenge. And I love this quote on the front here from Leila Slimani, who is the author of Lullaby, or The Perfect Nanny, depending where in the world you're watching from. Spit knows no fear. It is we, the readers, that are left trembling. I thought this sums up so well what makes controversial books so amazing. They can really scare the reader, scare you into asking yourself questions that you didn't know you were ready to ask yet. Concerning My Daughter by Kim Hae-jin is about a mother struggling to accept her daughter's relationship with another woman. And it is controversial because the mother is painted in a very sympathetic light, despite having beliefs that most of us would really struggle to accept. But the book is really about her journey towards love and acceptance. It's a wonderful book. And another controversial area that it goes into is the treatment of elderly people. So this mother works at an old person's home, and some of the corners that she is asked to cut in her treatment of her patients is really, really upsetting. So this book will spark conversations about the rights that we need to be giving all people and whether we are giving people those basic rights. The main character of New Animal by Ella Baxter is a controversial character. Amelia works in a funeral parlor and she uses sex as a way to process her emotions. In the aftermath of Amelia's beloved mother's sudden death, she runs away, missing the funeral, and starts experimenting with a BDSM community. So there is a lot to talk about in this book. The way that Amelia experiments with this community is bound to get people sitting up and noticing. And the author does not shy away from the more uncomfortable details, whether that's experimenting with sex, exploring grief, or getting up close and personal with death. Amelia's job at the funeral parlor is to arrange and prepare the bodies ready for them to be displayed, and the author takes you all the way with her. So it is a dark comedy about sex and death, and this book has already got quite a bit of a cult following. Mother for Dinner by Shalom Auslander is definitely controversial because this book is about cannibals. So our main character, Seventh, is the seventh child in the Seltzer family who are cannibal Americans. And their mother is absolutely devoted to their culture and their heritage. And on her deathbed, she is determined that her children will follow tradition and eat her. The book is a satire about identity and culture, the ways in which it is passed on, the ways in which it limits us. So that is bound to start some pretty controversial conversations, even without the whole eating people thing. Then there's The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Delilah Harris, and one of the most controversial things about this book has got to be their ending, which of course I will not ruin for you here, but right from the beginning the book dives into a controversial area, racism in the publishing industry. The book is about Nella, who is tired of being the only black girl at the publishing house where she works, so she is thrilled when Hazel joins the company. But things start to get strange pretty quickly. These two women start to be pitted against each other in a very uncomfortable way. And the book keeps taking darker and darker twists. Hazel somehow seems to be in on this competition. The book goes to areas you weren't expecting, it goes into genres that you weren't expecting, and it races towards a conclusion that will have your book club talking for hours. And finally, A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This book is probably the most famous on this list so far. It is very controversial, it is very divisive. I am firmly on team I love this book, but it is grim, it is heartbreaking, and there is a reason why people have spent so much time crying on TikTok over this book. The book is about abuse and self-harm and trauma, and it raises the question of whether there are some forms of trauma that are so powerful they can't ever be recovered from, which is a really uncomfortable, controversial question to grapple with. And I think that's what has made this book so popular and so divisive. I have actually been in book clubs to talk about the last 3 books I mentioned in this video, and they definitely kept us chatting for ages, which is just one sign of why books are so important when it comes to changing your mind on things. Do let me know in the comments below any controversial books you have read recently that have totally opened your mind to a new way of thinking. So I'm always looking for new recommendations like this. I will also link to a video I made on dark comedies, which can often do quite a similar thing in terms of changing the way that you think about the world. And I'll see you next time.